Can I be heard by everyone? So to answer Percy's question first, the format of the exam is one where you'll be shown 6 pictures of buildings which you have to identify. So you name the building, name the location, the period, and important people associated with those buildings if there are any. After these 6 identifications, you also will have 2 essay questions, short essays, and the questions will be asked directly. Hello, Maheshwar, Sanyukta, Karthik, and Sridhar. So today we are set up in this lab, which is a much easier setup than yesterday in the studio. And so if you have any questions, this might be a good time, and I'm happy to answer all of them. About Sanyukta's question, if I'm going to teach anywhere other than NPTEL, how does she find out about it? I don't think there's an easy answer, because if I do teach on any other platform, it's really up to those people to advertise as they see fit. About music and architecture, there are 2 kinds of simple connections between the two. One is a very simplistic one where we are talking about architecture that's designed for the performance of music. So whether it's auditoria, music halls, small recital rooms, and so on, which really deals with the realm of acoustics, and that is a technical architectural study. The other is how music and architecture have been understood as cultural expressions through time, and what might be similarities between the theorization of music and architecture. There is a lot about poetry and architecture, but there is very little that's actually done with music and architecture in that sense. Thank you, Percy. I'm glad it could be lucid, because unless I have some kind of feedback which a camera doesn't give, it's very difficult to tell how the lectures have been. Yes, we had this question yesterday too from Sridhar about Vastu Purush and Mandala as sacred geometries. Well, the Vastu Purush Mandala this human figure sitting cross-legged in 9 squares that you see very commonly used now is something that seems to gain currency only in the 20th century. You do have proportioning grids of various kinds that are used to lay out typically temples. So, for example, in the 6th century, you have the Brihat Samhita, which talks of the foundation of a temple where they say you need to draw a square, which is then subdivided into an equal number of squares on each side, and these form the proportions of the temple. We saw those kinds of proportions in the Garbhagriha of some of the temples in week 2, where you have walls that are half the thickness of the width of the sanctum. Can the others hear me? Because for some reason, Percy seems to have lost audio. Percy, something seems to be the problem at your end with the audio. Um, in the meantime, let me answer Sridhar's question on innovation and construction in Indian architectural history. There are several high points, not just one. Uh, the first high point, I think, is really um, in terms of the cave architecture, where it's a tremendous technical achievement to build caves of the kind that we see. So, sometime between the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD is a high point of technical achievement. Then, with the age of great temples, let's say from the 6th to the 11th century, you have an enormous technological achievement. Then again, with new forms of arcuated domed construction from the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, you have uh, again a very innovative phase in architecture. Of course, the length of the course needs to be increased. But since this was the first time I was doing something like this, I thought it would be better to keep it on the shorter side. And next time it would be structured perhaps longer and better. About the question of the role of architecture in conserving the tangible and intangible, I think most people can appreciate the tangible better than the intangible. And therefore, whenever you have to catalyze people around some kind of preservation movement, it helps to have an architectural marker because people rally around it much sooner. Remember, architecture is, you know, a reminder of things that are possible. And therefore, when, for example, somebody wants to really put down uh, people that they've conquered, what you do is very willfully and deliberately destroy things that they have built. I think the Bamiyan Buddhas in the last decade was certainly one of these objects. ISIS in Palmyra pulling down everything. You want to pull down tangible markers and reminders. Similarly, when you want to rally people, you might also build something around which people can rally. Again, I don't think which temple, I mean, there are a number of temples which are really superb. If you look at the Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjore, it's really unsurpassed, but they all have their own um special reasons as to why they have to be cherished. The Konark temple is another great one. The temple at Ranakpur from the 16th century is another fantastic temple. So uh, I would say highest attention to detail and craftsmanship. I wi- so this is for the benefit of Percy. We'll try and provide him the video and audio in some form. But in the meantime, you should really go around the cities that you live in, whichever city it is, whether it's Chennai, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Calcutta, Bhopal, Jaipur, Udaipur, Bangalore. It doesn't matter. Go around and try to identify buildings from various periods that we've studied, buildings of various types that we have studied. I think the value of this course is not so much in just being able to uh, analyze things on a computer screen, but to engage with real buildings and appreciate them for what they are. So, not all, yes, earlier. Sorry. Um, so, not all temples have something called a Jalakunda, uh, but all mosques will have some kind of ablution pool. So, there is a ritualized form of washing that one has to do before one prays in a mosque, but there is nothing ritualized. Besides, temples is a very wide open category. There are temples to all kinds of deities, some of whom might prefer washed people and some of whom might not. uh, Ashur Khanas are Shia houses of mourning, because one of the big communal events for the Shia community is to gather on the 10th for 10 days of Muharram and mourn the death of Hussein in battle. And Ashur Khanas are the places where you have a preacher uh, really reciting this event while people are in communal mourning. Now, talking of monuments protected by archaeological authorities, you are absolutely right, Madhu, that the practice of preservation, protection by the Archaeological Survey in India has been one where the contexts in which buildings are never preserved. What you have is a building put on a pedestal. So you build a quick enclosure around it, making it lose its entire connection with the neighborhood, with the people, with everything else around it. And increasingly around the world, people realize it's not single monuments that matter, but monuments with their entire context. This is just not happening in India, so it might be some time. I do not think that conserving the public realm and activities necessarily has a negative impact, but it really depends on the kinds of activities and the kind of public sphere you're trying to protect. So, if you think that a neighborhood which has always been known for criminal activity needs to be preserved as a historic marker, uh, it does become a questionable decision. Water bodies and temples come really in all directions. Most of them are square or round, and therefore directionality doesn't matter. But it will be oriented with respect to the main temple. Yes, it is very tempting to believe that we can find the first jali that inspired more. But I think the act of carving fine trellises, what we call jalis, is so widespread in India. You have a whole few centuries of it before the tomb of um, Siddhi Sayyid or Salim Chishti. And remember, Salim Chishti's tomb is before the tomb of Siddhi Sayyid anyway. So if there is any inspiration, it has to go the other way. But throughout Western India in particular, you've had a long tradition of carving jalis, and a number of temples have them. It does seem to be around Gujarat and Rajasthan that it takes on a completely different level of expertise. But you also have jalis like that in the south. It is a climatic response because as the breeze goes through a jali, the air compresses when it goes through the small holes, and then on the other side the air expands, and as air expands it cools, so all breezes are compressed and then expanded, thus cooling them. Jalis therefore keep the sun out and bring in air that's cool. Now this is something very unique to India because the climate demands it. Architectonic is something that deals with real architectural elements. So sometimes architectural qualities are extolled in terms of words, but architectonic really means pertaining to the actual built form, not a verbal quality, not a cognitive quality, but a very material quality of the building. Yes, the exam format is you will identify six buildings, providing key details about them. These are buildings that we've all seen through the lectures. If there is a building that you haven't seen in a lecture or we haven't talked about it in great detail, that is fine. We should have learned enough to make educated guesses about it, which would get you points. In addition to these six IDs, we have two essay questions where the answers are not to exceed 1,000 words each. Again, it is 6:21, and we shall carry on till about 6:45 today. Actually, yes. I mean, the most significant religious structure I can think of In terms of scale, you have lots of buildings which are absolutely grand, but architecturally, something that is innovative. You do have temples built, for example, by Achyut Kanvinde in Delhi. You have, of course, the Lotus Temple of the Baha'is built in Delhi again. Um, Things like the Birla Temple in Hyderabad or various other places cannot be considered architecturally innovative, as all they're doing is replicating historic styles from 400 or 500 years ago. But things like the Lotus Temple or Kanvinde's temples are reinterpretations of what temples should be. Um, in terms of grandeur, of course, I mean, as congregations and worshippers appear in ever larger numbers, people are building bigger and bigger houses of worship. Uh, Looking at the next question about Mandu's architecture, uh, is not the only place which has fantastic water engineering. In fact, most of the sultanates have superb ways of enjoying the role of water. In fact, this idea that water forms some kind of aesthetic to be enjoyed really seems to come about in the Sultanate period. Till then, when you have temples or Hindu or Buddhist religious structures with some kind of architecture that deals with water management, the thrust is on the architecture, not on the qualities of water by itself. This you really start seeing after the 14th century, when you have these cascades like chadors, you have cataracts, you have channels that carry water over distances between beds of flowers, and so on. And of course, if over the next month you have any questions, please do feel free to email your questions in. Not everything needs to be absolutely finished today. Um I will be traveling from the 2nd to the 22nd of March, so I might not be that regular in replying to emailed questions, but I will do my best. So, of course, a Gopuram is only a gateway, and the Shikharam is what marks the spot where divinity resides. It marks the vertical axis of divine presence. A Gopuram is nothing more than an elaborate and tall gateway which can be seen from a large distance. So the divine does not reside in the Gopuram, but the Shikhara is where the divine is located. Well, from the earliest temples, you've had some form of stairs or staircases because most temples are built on plinths. And to climb up to the plinth, you need an easy way, such as a staircase. Uh, a ramp is not that easy, particularly in a country which has very wet monsoons. Yes, there are real Kannats in the Sultanate period. In fact, the Kannats that have been recently revived are all around Bidar in North Karnataka. So if you're really interested in seeing Kannats, please get in touch with a foundation called the Yuva Foundation in Bidar, run by a gentleman called Vinay Malge, and he would be able to show you around the Kannats. Can contemporary architecture be regarded as artistic? Absolutely. Uh, but it might take the distance of some years for us before we start appreciating its aesthetic. Uh, a lot of art or a lot of architecture is not fully understood in its own period. Of course, which does not mean that everything built around us right now is necessarily of architectural or aesthetic merit. But we might be too close in time to appreciate even the good buildings. Why were corridors made around South Indian temples? By corridors, if you mean these big cloistered passages that are not attached to the temple but in the outer walls, those kinds of spaces serve many functions. They serve as dharmashalas, so people will often live there. Um, you can have rituals carried out there. They're very flexible spaces. They offer some kind of covered space for the variety of activities that are carried out in temple courtyards. They are not just a border, but they really are functional spaces. The function is not specified, but then, as temples get bigger, the range of functions it has to accommodate really increases. It is now 6:30. Yes, absolutely. Older, but the problem is we are mapping institutions, European institutions of today, onto learning institutions that we had of our own. To call them universities, I mean, universities are a very European idea from the medieval period, which also undergo significant changes through time. And therefore, to say that places like Takshashila and Nalanda were learning institutions is correct. Uh, to call them universities, yes, they have some elements of a modern university, but they were just great learning institutions. You can email me at this email address that I've just sent you. The reason for having large scale temples, temples that are truly monumental, is because temples started becoming very important corporations by the 8th, 9th century. We have several inscriptions that talk of how economically important temples are. In fact, there comes a time when it is not the royal court that holds power, but the temples really do. They have more money than the um, royal treasury, and therefore temples also need to be sacked by neighboring kings, which they often do. Think of temples as big corporations. Uh, and then, of course, if you have that kind of money, you want to do build something that is grand, that everybody looks up to, and fancy things attract money. So if you build a really fine temple, chances are that more people will donate to it. I do not know if this is to answer Madhu, whether religion is in dissent, because to those who feel they are deeply religious, they probably will say no. Uh, Whether religion is for the better or worse, whether it's improving or declining, is something left for people to believe in. But yes, as long as people believe that physical manifestations of power are required to make temples or religious buildings monumental, they will keep doing it. Uh, Vijay, temples probably start around the first century BC or the first century AD, but the earliest temples are built in temporary materials like timber. The oldest surviving temple that we have for Hinduism, for temple Hinduism, is from the 5th century, from about 420 or 425 of the Common Era. And so, as opposed to saying our temples are thousands of years old, I think the great achievement of temple architecture is that in a short span of 5 to 600 years, they evolved enormously. Buddhism had temples earlier because the mode of worship uh, of idols is older in Buddhist and Jain traditions. Hmm? Since we did have a session for an hour, it was very spotty. You only had audio, no video. Uh, Today, I think we might close the session at 6:45. Yes, sculptors still do exist, but tastes and fashions have changed that not all temples are completely covered with sculpture. However, if you look at any kind of temple style that's revivalist, sculpture is still being deployed on a large scale. Oh, yes, architecturally, they were absolutely designed for academics. You do have living cells, these vihara type structures. In fact, the name of the state Bihar comes from vihar, which does indicate a very large residential arrangement for all kinds of scholars who are coming there to study. You have shikharas that are both solid and hollow. And it really depends on which temple we are talking about, which period we are talking about, and what the scale of the shikhara is. So, uh, if you look at something very large from the 11th century, like the Brihadeshwara temple, it is hollow up to a point. If you look at late temples that are very small, they are completely solid. If you look at the temple that we spoke of, designed by Achyut Kanvinde in Delhi in the 1980s, it is completely hollow. Thank you, Sridhar. So let's see how the exams go. Good luck to everybody for the exams. I hope they're not too difficult. We shall be easy graders. Uh, but again, the point is to enjoy the course, enjoy things that you see around you, and try and make connections between the classroom and everyday life. In which case, not just at 6:4, well, I will be on till 6:45. If you have any more questions, do let me know. And of course, you can always ask anything on the discussion forum too. So you have a month, please enjoy looking at things, looking at the course modules. They are short for a reason, so that you can watch them again and again. The load calculations of the Shikara are really, I mean, we do have several instances of failed Shikaras too. So it's really a rule of thumb. There can be a course on the history of architecture in structural terms, but it would probably have to be taught by somebody else and not me. Though many years ago I did learn how to design buildings structurally, um, historic buildings are a whole different kettle of fish. In any case, shikaras were built by using rule of thumb methods, and so you build till it fails, and you therefore know what the point of failure is, and you don't build to that limit again. And again, there are several instances of failures that we know of. And the walls of the sanctum are so massive that as long as you can distribute uh, the load of the shikara onto the walls do not even need additional buttressing. The force lines are completely contained within the thickness of the walls. Thank you, Percy, and thank you everyone else for taking the time out to come and enjoy this. As I said, we'll be winding down at 6:45. So if anybody has any urgent questions, I do not know if we will do a rerun because I might be interested in perhaps running or recording another course at that time. It really depends on the kind of time we have. But we will run the course again at some point for sure, maybe not immediately, but next year. because if there is some effort that has gone into recording all these instructional videos, it would be a shame if it's used only once. The new course might be one that has to do with an introduction to the history of science and societies, something that is very relevant to the institution I teach in. Oh, it should be listed up on NPTEL, and you should be able to search it by last name. All right, everyone. Thank you again, and good luck with everything. Good night.